wanted to start doing a little bit of a topic at the start of these calls and then an open Q&A from there. So we had an interesting question sort of in the first couple of weeks of the course launching about how do you assess the 80-20 intensity balance in your athletes. So if you wanted to go and have a look and kind of work out, are your athletes actually adhering across a period of time to 80-20? How can you do it? And should you do it? Do you need to do it? I think that's also a question. So Matt and David are going to talk today about that whole looking at 80-20 within your coaching practice for your athletes and what you can do, what you should do to assess 80-20. So that's really going to be the sort of start of the call. And then we will switch to just general Q&A questions if anyone's got any questions. So I'm going to start. I think Matt's going to come on over. Slide in. I'm going to slide over and he's going to kind of open us up.
All right. Okay. So thank you, Leyla.
You're welcome. Is that normal that he's on the screen?
Yes. So good to see you all. Good to be here with my 80-20 compadres and my wife who's listening in, her first summit. And yeah, so when I am asked versions of this question, I always have two immediate thoughts. And the question again is like, how do I know if my athlete is actually training 80-20? And so as a big picture type of coach who is always trying to not lose the forest for the trees, I have like the first thing I want to communicate when I begin to address that question is like a word of caution, because there's certain, like I'm guessing that perhaps that question was asked by like a more analytically minded coach, and there's nothing wrong with being analytically minded, but sometimes those are the folks who can start to get a little bit too data focused and sort of lose perspective. And a big part of what we're trying to do with the course is, and we're explicit about this, teach coaches how to think and how to creatively problem solve versus how to paint by numbers, like how to do things by rote. So it's not that it is bad to know what David will show you in a couple of minutes about like, well, here's actually the actual answer to your question. Like here's how you do know, how much time an athlete is actually spending at low intensity, moderate, and high, or in the zone distribution. But I think before you get to that, you just want to say what I'm about to say, just to provide sort of a general perspective. So yeah, not harmful to know that information and to be able to use it, to keep athletes on track. But in terms of like, what is the forest? So the trees is what David is going to show you. The forest is, maybe, can we put it in the chat or something? I wrote a blog post, maybe some people on the call read it a while ago. It's how to train 80-20 without really trying. So it's on the 80-20 endurance blog. We'll pop someone's on it now, popping the link into the chat. And I think, something that it's important to keep in mind is to remind ourselves where this 80-20 intensity balance came from, right? It came from, it was first like learned about or discovered when scientists like Stephen Seiler, analyzed the data of world-class endurance athletes. So, elite level runners, cyclists, swimmers, cross-country skiers, rowers, etc. Looked at what they were actually doing with their training and discovered that they were doing about 80% of their training at low intensity, the remaining 20% at moderate to high intensity, which is kind of cool and interesting. But the thing not to forget is that the elite athletes who were training this way had no idea they were training this way. So they were doing 80-20 without actually fussing over the numbers, without actually sitting down on the calculator. So that's where it all came from. So what this shows you is that it is possible to maintain an 80-20 intensity balance. The analogy I like to make is like, suppose you're someone who is like, your goal is to maintain a stable body weight. So whatever weight you are today, you kind of want to stay there. And you might think, if you're analytically minded and prone to lose the forest for the trees, that it's very important for you to count calories right? You have to count calories every day in order to maintain a stable body weight, because isn't that the thing? Isn't that the input that allows you to maintain a stable body weight? But is that actually necessary? Folks who are actually over a period of months and years maintaining a steady, stable body weight, are they actually counting calories every day? No, they're not. So it's just, so if there's an easier way to accomplish whatever you're trying to accomplish, do it the easier way. And so, so how is it that elite athletes are able to maintain a consistent 80-20 intensity balance in their training without even trying? They do it in two ways. And these are kind of like just basically two rules. It's like the easy way to train 80-20 that I talk about in the aforementioned blog post. Rule number one is make sure you're actually training at low intensity when you intend to. That's number one. So like, as we know, the typical recreational endurance athlete, they are more often than not at moderate intensity when they think they are or intend to be at low intensity. So rule number one, in order to actually train 80-20 without really trying, is to know where the dividing line between low and moderate intensity is for you. So to know where your first ventilatory threshold is. And I think most of us on the call are familiar with the methods for doing that. They're in the course. So if you can use either pace or power or heart rate, or even a talk test / perceived effort to determine where your first ventilatory threshold is, then it becomes fairly easy to know. You're basically establishing zones, right? So zone 1 and zone 2 are sub VT1, X and above or above it. So if you have the athletes that you coach know where that dividing line is, between zone 2 and zone X is what we're really talking about. And so when they're supposed to be below it, they're consistently below it. That's one of only two rules you really need to follow to adhere to an 80-20 intensity balance without actually drilling deep down into the data. The second rule has to do with frequency of hard workouts. So if you look at the training of elite endurance athletes, not in every sport, but in the ones that I think most of us are involved in, running, cycling, triathlon, and those sports, if you look at the training calendar or the training journals of elite endurance athletes, about 1 out of every 3 training sessions they do is focused on either moderate or high intensity. So, that's a lot less granular than looking at what intensity you're at in every minute of every workout, which you can do, but it's a lot easier to kind of zoom out and say, hey, if I maintain a low intensity, if I'm in zone 2 when I'm supposed to be, and if one of about every 3 training sessions I do is focused on moderate or high intensity, you do those 2 things, and guess what? When you actually do drill down into the data, you're going to find that you're pretty close to 80-20. And as I say, way back in 80-20 running, there is no magic in round numbers. It doesn't have to be exactly 80-20. If you find that by following these 2 rules, you discover that, well, actually you're more like 72-28. All right, then maybe you can do a little bit of fine tuning, which are really just you can still do the same frequency breakdown where about 1 of every 3 training sessions is moderate to hard focused, but you can do a little fine tuning about in terms of the exact design of those workouts. How much time are you at moderate or high intensity within those sessions? And then you can find little ways to include a little bit if you're not getting enough moderate or high intensity, you can do a fast finish or a little sprinkling of fartleks in another session per week. So, but that's all just fine tuning. You follow those 2 rules, and these are the ones I encourage you to just focus on, because it's onerous to count calories every day, and it's onerous to drill deep down into the intensity metrics every day. So the sort of low hanging fruit is make sure your athletes are at low intensity when they're supposed to be, and make sure about 1 out of every 3 sessions is focused on moderate to high intensity. That's how the elites maintain an uncannily exact 80-20 intensity balance without even knowing they're doing it. And now I'm going to pass it on to David to contradict everything I just told you.
Thanks, Matt. I kind of feel like the parent that sits down with their kids and says, hey, don't drink, do not drink. It's bad. This is why you shouldn't drink. but if you do decide to drink, here's how to do it, right? So we're gonna encourage you to just use these high level principles, but if you want to dig down and actually get into it, we can do that. The other analogy that Matt gave us this morning on one of our meetings was that he said, hey, let's say you're to your left, you're trying to get to this house. There's a house to your left. You have two ways you can get to that house. You can walk 100 feet to your left and get to the house, or you can circumvent the entire globe and go to the right and go all the way around and experience all of that to get to the same house. So you're getting to the same point, but sometimes it is an easier point A to point B can be a little bit easier than going through all the details of the more complex way. But let's pop open Training Peaks, because really Training Peaks is going to be the primary method. You can measure this. There are other methods, but most of you are going to be in Training Peaks. And so we're going to start there. Also, I just want to say how happy I am to have you guys here. We're so lucky to have all of you as our coaches going through this course. We now have hundreds of individuals who have signed up for the course. You know, I was personally hoping that we'd have dozens by this time, but we far exceeded my expectations. And big thanks to Leyla and Hannah for their great work on getting that together. All right, I'm going to share my screen with you and pull up a couple examples in Training Peaks. All right, so in Training Peaks, we picked an athlete. I'm picking myself. Normally, I'd actually pick a real athlete, but I didn't have time. I usually have to get permission. If I don't want to just pull up a random person and share their data, right? So I'm using myself in this example.
I don't want to say that David's a robot. And
Yeah,
it's not
that's
real
right.
person.
Yeah, the jokes are flying about my robotic nature of training. So I'm picking myself because I didn't get permission from an athlete to say, hey, can I pull up all your data and share it to, you know, after the recording could be dozens or hundreds of people. So I'm in the dashboard. So I picked a period of time where I felt like, you know, I just picked a month where I thought this is a good month. I remember this back in 2020, before we knew it was going to happen in 2020, when training was going well, when I had visions of competing in Ironman California, when everything was still happening, and my training was going, you know, pretty good at that time. In the dashboard, you do need to create this time in Power Zones Bike, or time in heart rate zones, or time in pace. So I don't have a time in pace zones right now. I have a time in bike zones. I have a time in heart rate zones. So let's add a new chart for time and pace zones. It's super easy. We're going to come down here, or time and speed zones, just drag it on over. And now I have a nice chart that shows me how much time in this period. Right now I'm using a default in the dashboard for a 1 month period. You can change that to a year. You can change it to 6 months. But this is a default period of bike, heart rate for all zones. Let's say I want to stick with, I'm going to go with bike on this one too. I'm just going to look at the bike. Sorry, the zoom is in my way. There we go. Switching that to bike. And then I'm going to go in speed. We probably don't want all, because that's going to include your bike zones, right? We're going to go with just run on speed. So if you don't have these charts, it's easy to add these charts to your dashboard, and of course for an individual athlete. So you'll pull up the athlete, you go to dashboard, you'll click on this charts library, you'll add time and power zones, or time and heart rate zones, or time and speed zones, or all three, right? It depends on what the primary measure of your athlete is, but you can look at all three. All right, so probably next question is, well, now how do I tell how they're doing? Training Peaks does not use the naming conventions of the author's zone system. So you'll notice there's no zone X down here. There's no zone Y down here. Training Peaks simply takes the number of zones that the plan author or the zone system that the athlete is using and does an ordinal scale. So in this case, zone 1 is zone 1, zone 2 is 80-20 zone 2, zone 3 is 80-20 zone X, zone 4 is 80-20 zone 3, zone 5 is 80-20 zone 4, zone 6 is 80-20 zone Y, and zone 7 is 80-20 zone 5. So just go up the scale, and that's the zone 80-20 zone 1 through zone 5, 7-zone system when you add in the zone X and zone Y. But all you really have to look at, unless you want to get really granular in the 80-20 distribution, is how much time are they spending in zone 1 and 2, right? And how much time are they spending at moderate to high intensity? Because our easy intensity is just zone 1 and 2. So I've picked power here for this particular month. There's no, you know, like easy button in here. You just have to do the math. 60% plus that 13.5%. So David was doing about 74% of his time in power for that month in zone 1 and zone 2. Fairly straightforward. Heart rate, same thing. We've got 20% plus 57%. He was doing about 78% of his time. Why am I speaking to myself in third person? Of my time. Yeah, robot. There we go. That's the robot. So on heart rate. The other thing to remember, and I will, by the way, I will take questions. I know I'm just going fast and spitting things out, but we'll absolutely take questions and make sure we can cover anything I haven't covered here. You'll notice a couple of things. One is that these don't exactly match, especially if we come down here to pace, right? If I add, well, this is actually the run, so it's not going to match, but these are both bike, right? So these aren't matching exactly. And that's going to be very normal for a couple of reasons. One is that the nature of heart rate is that if I ask you to go from a zone 1 to a zone 5 interval, you have to, your heart rate, your BPM has to pass through every other zone in between. So you have to go to get to zone 5, you have to go into zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone X, zone Y before you can get to 5. And heart rate takes its time, right? Even a well-conditioned athlete is going to take a good 30 to 60 seconds to get from zone 1 to zone 5. Whereas power is kind of like the quantum leap. It doesn't have to go from point A to point B, right? With power, if I ask you to go from zone 1 to zone 5, you can do it almost instantly. And that power sampling is typically just 1 every second, right? But in about 3 seconds, you can go from zone 1 to any zone. So you don't have this pass-through problem with power that you do with heart rate. So this zone 2 and zone 3, for example, or zone 2 and zone X, represent the effort it took to get both to zone 3, 4, and 5, as well as get back down to zone 1. It has to pass through on the way up, and it has to pass through on the way back down. Those of you who've worked with us for a long time know that I'm not a huge fan of heart rate. I'm not anti-heart rate, but in addition to the several disadvantages that come with heart rate, this is another one, is that you can't truly measure the 80-20 intensity ratios because heart rate has to pass through all of those segments before you get to the actual desired zone. The other thing that it doesn't reflect here, of course, is that heart rate is going to be influenced by things like temperature and time of day, humidity. And so whereas power, a watt is always a watt, the amount of effort that it takes, or the heart rate that is reflected for that effort is going to vary wildly based on your environment. So that this particular zone 4, let's say, or zone rather 3 and 80-20 here, that required was 250 watts per individual. On a hot day, that's going to be about 165 BPM. On a cold day, it's going to be 155 BPM, right? So these will never line up. And don't worry about it if they don't. That's just 2 of the 3 of many reasons why these 2 won't always line up. Pick one intensity measure for your athlete and stick with it. If you're using heart rate, just know that it's not going to be exact, but you're just looking for some sort of trend like this, right? Where you're looking for a lot of time in zone 1, zone 2, trailing off into those other intensities. So I have a few more things to cover. Let's pause there. Are you tracking questions by chance on the?
No, but yeah, if they've got any questions.
Great. If you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat or just start talking.
I can see some typing happening.
Okay, there's some bubbles going on over there,
Yeah, I
some
can
little
see
typing
some.
bubbles. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've got a question. On training feet, so from JW, on training feet, speed is pace.
Yes, I mean, there's a difference between speed and pace, right? So this is getting way too technical now, but yes, I'm just going to leave it at that now, that yes, for our purposes, if you change the chart to just cover run, this is your run pace, time and run pace zones. Yes. So for that month, I was going very, very easy, right? A lot of easy running for that first month of the year. And that's okay. Remember, 80-20 intensity balance is also, you can have periods of time where you're not following those ratios exactly, right? We do a week is our default, 2 weeks, a month at a time, great. But if you end up going a month or 2 in a maintenance phase or recovery phase, an off-season phase that is super easy, that's okay, right? Doesn't have to be 80-20 all the time. Okay, another questions. Something else I want to bring up that I think is relevant too. Actually, you're going to look at this data for one of 2 ways, right? The first thing you might consider is, how can I go back and look at how an athlete has been doing at the 80-20 ratio? So I have a new athlete. Can I go back and look and see how bad or how good they've done in the past? And the answer is sort of, because one of the problems is that these zones, when a workout is done in Training Peaks, it's like set in stone when it's assigned a zone. So whatever zones you have set up, whatever zones the athlete had set up at the time they did the workout, that is set in stone. If they had a 5-zone system on January 1st, 2020, and they did a workout, Training Peaks is going to assign those intensity into those 5 zones, and then it's set. Training Peaks didn't always work like that. So I did some more testing this morning because Training Peaks makes changes all the time without, telling us, right? So what I did just to make sure this was the case is I went in and changed my my power zones for my FTP was 1,000 watts. So I made my FTP for the bike 1,000 watts, saved it, reset, came back into Training Peaks. If my FTP is 1,000 watts, there's no way this distribution exists, right? There's no way that I'm spending 6% of my time in zone 7, which is going to be 900 watts, right? So clearly Training Peaks did not retroactively or does not dynamically change. It kept the static data that I had for that period of time. So that's an advantage and a disadvantage, but you just need to know that you can't like go back and change their zones from the default Training Peak zones or from CTS or from Coggan or whatever they've been using, switch into 80/20 and then do historical data. It's going to stick them in the past for the zones that they had set before, which means it's going to be very difficult for you to actually measure how they were doing previously. But my counterpoint to that is, why do we care, right? Doesn't matter how bad they were doing with the 80/20 ratios before. You're their coach now. This is a new era. You're the boss. You can move them forward. Let's just look at a forward-looking, how are they doing going forward? And then it does work, because then you can change their zones in Training Peaks to the 80/20 intensity balance, to our 7-zone system. And from this point forward, they will be using our system, and then you can measure it here with these 7 zones, knowing that 3 is X and 4 is 3, etc. All right, let me, so if there's no other questions, let me pull over something else I want to do as well. We have also, you can, of course, in Training Peaks, look at an individual workout. So what I've done here, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble navigating because the Zoom is covering what I want to cover. Here's an individual workout, right? So this is an individual, we're not going to the dashboard this time, I'm just opening up an individual workout. We can click on Analyze, and you'll note we have the exact same thing, the exact same system here for an individual workout. I can do the exact same multiplication or addition, of zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, etc. So an untrained coach would look at this and say, oh, that's a terrible workout. Look how much time he spent in moderate to high intensity, and hardly any time. He only spent, 40% of his time, 50% of his time in zone 1 and zone 2. But again, 80/20 is not about an individual workout. The distribution is over a macro period, over a longer period of time, a week minimum, 2 weeks, 3 weeks or more. And so it doesn't matter that this individual workout doesn't line up with the 80/20 principles, because that wasn't the purpose of this workout. This was an interval workout, which had a lot of high intensity. That's the purpose of the workout. If I opened up another workout, it would have 100% of the time in zone 1, zone 2, right? That would be just a nice foundation run, foundation cycling, where it would just have nothing but zone 1, zone 2. Again, the heart rate doesn't line up, not a problem, because it has to pass through. And also because this was a cold day in January, where the heart rate for the athlete, again, third person, was very low because of the cold. And so it's just not going to line up beautifully, but don't worry about it. Pick power if you have power, don't use heart rate, and you'll be fine.
I have a question. Well, I know the answer, so I'm asking it to tell everybody. When someone's executing a workout, what's your sort of guidelines for letting them travel into another zone for one of the metrics? So they're running the pace, it's a warm day, and then you're looking at 80/20 afterwards as a coach.
Right.
What's your sort of
Yeah.
ways that you can interpret, and sort of where's the level of, well, that's not a problem, or where does it become something we worry about?
Yeah, that is a very common question. I'm glad you asked it. So in case you couldn't hear Leyla, she's saying, are there times where you can give athletes a little bit of leeway in when you prescribe a zone 2 workout? Is there any kind of flexibility in that workout for them to stray outside of zone 2 or even down into zone 1? And the answer is yes, in 2 ways. First of all, remember, particularly with zone 1 and zone 2, the dividing line between zone 2 and X is empirical. Like that's VT1. That is for us, we draw the line in the sand. That is our 80/20. It's one of the core principles, is keep them 80% below VT1. That is our easy. That's zone 1, zone 2. But when Matt and I divided up zone 1, zone 2, that wasn't empirical, right? The zone 1, zone 2 distribution is just based on our experience and is somewhat arbitrary. We chose what we thought would be a good distribution or dividing line between zone 1 and zone 2. They're both easy. So if we're prescribing you a zone 1 workout, you can do zone 2. If we're prescribing you zone 2, you can do zone 1. They're both easy, right? So if you're having a really tough week and you're struggling staying in zone 2, no problem. You can drop it down to zone 1. Same with if let's say we're telling you to recover in zone 1, you're like, oh, I have to walk. And you don't want to walk, easy jog in zone 2, no problem. They're both easy in the 80-20 system. On the other side, if we're prescribing a zone 2 workout, let's say that we're saying zone 2, and you have your monitoring by power, but your athlete also has some heart rate. And this is what Leyla's real question is even though heart rate, again, isn't my favorite, one of the advantages in heart rate is it can act as a backstop. It can act as a safety from overtraining or going too hard. So if someone, it's 90 degrees, they're doing a run, they're doing a ride, and their power is just right at the top of zone 2, right? They're just flirting with zone 2. If their heart rate drifts into zone X, I'm not worried about it, right? That's a hot day, cardiac drift, that's going to happen, right? If their heart rate drifts 2 zones higher, then I think it's appropriate to say you got to back off the power. So I use what's basically a 2-zone or 2 degrees of separation essentially from the target zone. If I prescribe a zone 3 workout, and I don't include zone Y because it's just a small zone, right? Zone Y. If I prescribe zone 3, but they're drifting into zone 4 on heart rate, I'm okay with that. They drift into zone 5, back off the intensity, so they're no more than 1 zone higher on heart rate than what we've prescribed. It obviously only works if you're monitoring more than 1 metric at a time, pace and heart rate or power plus heart rate. It's one of the few examples where I rely on heart rate to help me maintain an appropriate intensity. There's no science behind that. That is just the rule of David. It's just the 2 degrees of separation is just something I came up with that it seems to work for athletes in maintaining the appropriate intensities in a workout when it's like really hot outside or when the workout's really long.
I have another question.
Yeah.
I'm hoping I'm asking some
Yeah.
questions that maybe coaches have, but
Yeah.
just not coming to mind. How is there any point at which on training volume in a week that the 80-20 principle starts to not be relevant?
Matt, do you want to take this one? Matt has a really good answer on this one, I feel like.
That's another, you're asking great questions that you know the answer to.
Yes, but we need to ask a question that she can answer, right?
Yeah, so when this question is asked, like, does the 80-20 apply across like all potential training volumes in the continuum? And, like, it's a sensible question. You can wonder, does it apply at really, really low volumes? And does it apply at really, really high volumes? I would say, like, we have a pretty clear answer on the high side. Remember, the 80-20 rule came from analyzing the data of elite endurance athletes who train at the highest volumes that anyone does on earth. So clearly it applies on the high side. Now there could be a case like, well, what if you just want to go completely nuts with volume? Yeah, there's gonna come a point when, in order to do more volume, you're going to have to back off that 20%. But the question is, why would you do that? If there were any conceivable benefit in it, that's what the elites would be doing. They would be sacrificing intensity for even greater volume. And there's some individuality involved as well. And I guess the third thing I would say is that if you're going to err on the side of more volume and less intensity. So if you just got it in your head that you have to do more volume, but you find you're struggling a little bit, I would say give up, go from 80-20 to 85-15 or something like that. On the low side, it's more germane, right? Because like imagine really, really low volumes, like, training 20 minutes a day, 3 times per week. Again, common sense might suggest that, you might as well make the most of those 20 minutes 3 times per week and make it all high intensity, or at least just make them all high intensity interval sessions. So it ends up being more like 50-50. That's a really interesting question. I tend to think, I put this exact question to Steven Seiler. I have a blog post on every subject. If you go to the blog and go into the search and put in the Boolean search, Steven Seiler volume 80-20, something like that, you're going to come up with this blog post where I asked him, like, at extremely low volume, like, does it still make sense to do 80-20? Just like, what does the science say? Science doesn't have no one has made a rigorous attempt to find out where that floor is. I do think there probably is a floor, but then it's like, okay, are you even an endurance athlete anymore if you're training 20 minutes a day, 3 times a week? And I would say also in terms of like one of the studies involving age group recreational athletes, that was one of the studies done to validate whether 80-20 applies to recreational endurance athletes. That study found a benefit at about runners who trained about 35 miles per week. So they had a large group of male Spanish club level runners, and they had half of them continue doing what they were normally doing, which was kind of like 50-50, and they had half switched to 80-20. And even at a very modest club level training volume of about 35 miles of running per week, the runners improved when they switched from the moderate intensity rut to 80-20. So we know at that sort of, very common, doable recreational volume level, the floor is definitely below that. So, I think like sometimes like, if you need to travel or there are circumstances other than injury or illness that artificially really suppress your training volume over a period of time, I do think it can be helpful to lean on intensity a little bit more. Just to sort of like, it's sort of like you're treating it almost as a taper. And in taper, you don't do 80-20, you do more like 70-30. But yeah, that's the basic answer to the question, is that honestly, 80-20 applies at all conceivable training volumes with a little bit of fine print in there.
Lisa had a question. She said, like for race often athletes, where we've talked about that in the course actually, and you're not like, I guess that's just being practical, right? When you've got a race often athlete, you're not really looking at 80-20, you're looking at recovering them, adding a little bit of race specific work in. So there's times when you're not over analyzing 80-20, I assume, because so Elisa's question is, we don't do this for race often athletes, but I would assume you still kind of are, because you're looking a bit broader.
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that question is that racing is exercise. So you count it as a workout. You count it as a workout you don't get to plan as a coach. And I address this in 80-20 Endurance, the book that comes with the course. Like I address the specific, coaching, high school cross country runners who like, they got to race every Saturday, and how you make that work. You're still human, which means the 80-20 principle still applies, but you just have special constraints that you need to work with. And, there's a little bit of fine print there in terms of like what you do in the preseason to get folks prepared so they can sort of use the races as workouts to kind of race their way into shape. But it's not as if the 80-20 principle, like you cannot really maximize fitness development on any other intensity ratio. So you just have to be, in special situations like that, you have to in fact, there's just more to the conversation that like, maintaining an 80-20 intensity balance is only one of several things you need to do in order to get athletes fitter. So then like the nuances there, like, well, the races are pretty much probably all the same intensity. So like, do you really want to do workouts that are also at that intensity? What's the point? You're getting more work than you need at race intensity in races. So you're sort of looking at, yeah, it's still 80-20, but you're actually apportioning things up a little bit differently to ensure that the workouts that are separate from the races complement the races in terms of intensity. So if races are like let's say zone 4, if we're talking about high school runners, 5K, that's a zone 4 thing. You're not going to do a lot of zone 4 intervals in training. Like maybe from the transition to the end of summer base training into the beginning of the race season, you do a little bit of that to prep them for the races, but then the races are going to do the rest of that. And the rest of your 20% is going to be stuff in complementary zones, X, 3, Y, and 5. And 4.
David with an E on the end asked a question.
Oh, Davida.
Yeah. You were talking about power and heart rate and the crossing over the zones. Does that same thing apply for power and pace? I'm assuming people running with power.
Gotcha.
And
if David is referring to the 2 degrees of separation principle, I have not used it for anything but heart rate. So I have not used that on a pace power combo. I've only used it on a pace heart rate combo or a power heart rate combo as the secondary. I'd have to put some thought into it if I would use, I don't think I would, just because, pace and power are outputs and outcomes. Heart rate is an indicator. And the reason I allow for this exception for using heart rate is that sometimes an indicator is important, like the engine light in your car. When it gets really up there at really high temperatures, sometimes you do have to say, should I be backing off? Is this normal? It's almost an engine warning light, right? So I have to put some thought into it, but I don't mix and match pace and power hardly ever.
I'll add to that as well. Like if you're looking at, I agree with that answer. If let's say you're just looking at, we'll go back to our example of zone 4 interval session, and you look at 3 different metrics that you could use to monitor intensity in that session: pace, heart rate, and power. Like, I don't know, 7 times 2 minutes in zone 4 is the workout. If you look at, the data, post workout, the heart rate file is going to say the athlete spent much more time above zone 2, in and around zone 4 than their power file is. It's just because like power is instantaneous. So when you go from the warm up to your first zone 4 interval, instantaneously you're in zone 4. And then when you come back down at the end of it, more to the point, you go instantaneously from zone 4 to zone 1 for the active recovery. In heart rate, you don't. In heart rate, as soon as that warm up is over, you're above zone 2 for the entire interval block and into the recovery. So I think that's actually the main reason that those, that especially over time, if you're looking at a whole month, you're just going to have all of that like bleed over from cardiac lag is what you're talking about. And you don't get that phenomenon with pace. Like if you look at a pace file and a power file for that zone 4 workout, they're going to match, they're going to align very closely because they don't really have that lag phenomenon.
So here's a good question from Lisa. She said, and David has said, thank you. How do you approach it when an athlete decides, well, this is another strong, but how do you approach it when an athlete decides to sneak a few more races in after you've already created their training plans for the season? Look at that.
You have the floor.
I mean, you put the fear of God into them. I mean, that's what I do. Like, first of all, because I routinely put the fear of God in my athletes, they're not going to do that. Like, I mean, I can't think of an example of an athlete. Every now and then, like they start to stray in that direction. I do this, and they're like, "Okay, I'm not going to try that again." So they got to really keep it on the DL in order to to get away. But it's true. Like in all seriousness, there are times, and some coaches are more or less comfortable. Like I'm a hard ass, and I do not mind. Youth coaches do this all the time, and we forget that just because we coach adult athletes doesn't mean we can't call them to the carpet sometimes and let them know it's like, we have to be on the same page. Like honestly, like that is an ethical breach on the part of the athlete. Like that's your athlete lying to you, and lying through omission is still lying. So for me, like they will get a warning. And they will get one warning, and I'll fire them if they do that again. It's just like, you're uncoachable. I'm sorry. Come back to me when you're willing to just communicate with me honestly. Like if you don't have honesty in both directions, I'm honest with my athletes, so I expect the same standard from my athletes. So that's my hard ass answer to that question.
I think it's easy for Matt and Leyla and I to say this because we can pick and choose our athletes, right? We can fire people, and we can pick someone up right away. So for your new coaches, that's going to be a hard conversation because it might be one of only 2 or 3 athletes that you have. But I think that's right. You still have to say, hey, look, when you do this, I can't effectively coach you. This is the impact it has on you. This is the impact it has on me. So maybe if you're a new coach and you're trying to build that client portfolio, you might give them 3 warnings or 2 warnings, but it just can't go on. That's exactly right. You can't have any relationship, personal or professional, if there's not trust involved, and they've hired you based on that trust. So if you're a new coach, maybe give them a little bit more slack, but make it clear how it impacts your ability to coach them.
And you're not doing yourself any favors if you bend too much. You're just you're establishing a pattern. It's like trying to be nice to people you don't want to be around. Like, what's the point? You're just going to be around people you don't want to be around if you're too nice. So, yeah.
JW said he's just sharing, his experience with someone that told him 2 weeks before the Vancouver Marathon that they were just doing it as their long run. And it's just, I think sometimes as well, you can see it first and foremost. I think I always try and think, why would they do that? Do I need to, is there some education missing? Like, have I not shared the message of like a marathon isn't a training run for most athletes? I mean, there's probably some athletes who could do it, but for most athletes, that's not a training run, and it's going to impact future programming, their recovery. We know a marathon is going to take longer to recover from it. So first point can be when you're a new coach is definitely like, hey, listen, maybe I didn't explain this well enough, or we're like, let's sit down and talk about this. But if it becomes a repeat habit, then it's definitely, there's a trust, like you're not on the same page, and it actually makes coaching harder for you because they're kind of stressful athletes. They stress you out in a way because you don't know what they're getting up to. And if they're sneaking workouts and then having injuries or issues or not, it takes a lot, but I think you have to have the courage to say, listen, you're making my job difficult as a coach. I don't know if I can continue to coach you. And that usually corrects them, because I think a lot of people at first just haven't been coached and they're learning how to be in that coach-athlete relationship. But definitely, sort of 1 or 2 strikes and then listen, this looks like now it's a habit and you need to find someone else to do it. And it helps you a lot, because I think then you can build that better relationship with your athletes and be more open. And like sometimes people want to do crazy stuff, but if you're part of that process with them and you explain, you had a chance to talk pros and cons of that, and they really want to do it, it means a lot to them. Sometimes for certain athletes, like, well, okay, we'll do it together, but it's not a good idea. That can happen, but we're going to get a wide range of people with not necessarily a full experience in being an athlete, being in that coach-athlete relationship. So yeah, it's tricky. Not a fun one when people do a marathon like out of the blue on you, and you're like, I have to schedule that.
You know what, though, we should probably add is that you should set that expectation up front, right? So if an athlete, like you said, Leyla, did I not communicate correctly? I was just sitting here thinking, if an athlete did that to me and just said, hey, oh, by the way, I did a marathon over the weekend. If I hadn't specified to them, you need to let me know about, these changes, that's sort of my bad, right? But early on, just set that expectation that, hey guys, we have to have good communication. Tell me what you're doing, what you want to do, and it probably won't come up.
Yeah. I think another thing to add to that is not just races, but getting athletes to tell you stuff that impacts training in general, like an injury or an illness. Like sometimes they don't tell you these things either because they don't want to bother you, whatever's the cause of it. So sometimes some onboarding documentation is really helpful to outline, what you expect from them as athletes. I expect you to tell me of these situations. I expect you to communicate with me in a timely manner of anything that will impact your training. And then that just keeps you informed, and you can do your job well then. You can go and change things for them in the training, and sort of stay up to date, and it builds that trust. But you do need to establish it early with did you read that? Do you want to go over it? I just want to be clear about communication. Here's how we will communicate. And that's up to you as a coach. You set those guidelines, but it will make your life easier if you've had that conversation with people early on what you want them to tell you and what's important for you as a coach to be able to.
Yeah, no, those are awesome recommendations. Karma did get him. I think it was only 4 weeks later, we had our first 50K race, first transition. He's like, I should have listened to you.
Yeah, it's usually, yes, that's always like sort of, it's not a great moment, but it's also as a coach, you're like, yeah, I told you. So,
and we also have learned things the hard way, so you got to have some empathy.
For sure.
Yep.
So we've got about 15 minutes left. So if anyone's got any other general questions, you're welcome to take your mic off mute and ask them. We're happy to hear your voices, or pop them in the chat and I can read them out. But if you've got any other general questions about the topic we just covered, or the course itself, or where we are at with our release.
Can I actually toss in a use case for I feel like we didn't quite complete the lesson. Mm-hmm. It's been bugging me. So I'm just, because I don't think we were quite explicit, like, when and why would you want to make these kind of post hoc analyses of training zone distribution? And I'll just give you an example of like when it would make sense and be useful. And I actually talk about this in the book, the aforementioned book. Like say you had your coach, a mountain biker who has like a favorite trail they like to ride fairly often, but it's technical and it's steep, and they like to do their long endurance rides on there, which are, for the most part supposed to be zone 2 rides, but you're pretty confident that it's impossible for even the fittest athlete to stay in zone 2 all the time. So you might want to like look at the actual impact. You could prescribe it as zone 2, but it's not going to be entirely in zone 2. So after the week of training is complete, you can look at not just that session, but the entire week. Okay, I planned an 80-20 week. What did they actually do partly as a consequence of including that favorite, ride that they like to do? And you can see, well, actually, I planned an 80-20 week, but they did 75-25 week or whatever. So now you know the difference between planning and execution. And it doesn't mean you have to say you can't do that ride anymore, because look what it does to the intensity balance. You as a coach can actually find a way to accommodate that ride. So, if it's having, because it's like things don't happen in isolation. Like the time spent in zone X and zone 3 in that long endurance, mountain bike ride is going to impact the athlete's ability to get into the higher zones the rest of the week. So what you can do is say you can count on it, like that ride that would normally be all zone 2 is not going to be all zone 2. So I'm going to trim back some of the intensity in the rest of the week so that it fits, because good coaches do allow athletes to exercise their preferences. It's like maybe it's a group ride and it's just like the motivation that they get and from the camaraderie and being out in their favorite environment is totally worth it. So it's worth troubling you to find a way to make that fit. So that's just one example of like when it really does make sense. It's like, well, I planned an 80-20 week, so the athlete must have done an 80-20 week. That isn't always the case. So that's a concrete example of how you might use this kind of post hoc analysis.
Yeah, and I think that sort of lends to that whole making sure that you are going into the analysis section of the workouts and really seeing the execution and not just looking at that, okay, it was a 2-hour ride, they did 2 hours. That's, you've got to really see the habits of your athletes and go a little deeper and see how did this actually work out and what do they tend to do? Because it'll catch up with even the best of athletes if those sort of group rides, or mountain biking is a great example, because depending on the course they choose can change the whole intensity of the workout. So if you've got any mountain bikers, you have to keep an eye on that intensity depending on where they ride, and trail runners. I think another question for me is like, how do you help athletes navigate this tendency in running to slip into a momentum kind of approach to their run and say it was easy, it did feel easy, and they but it's not. You can see it's not, they're not progressing as they should, because it's just, they're on the upper end of zone 2 all the time, or in Z all the way in X and tickling through, but they keep saying it feels easy.
Mm-hmm.
So they're telling you it feels easy because the running itself, maybe at that pace, feels better to them. When they slow down, they tell you it doesn't feel comfortable. How do you kind of unravel that with it, or what are your advice when you're dealing with that type of athlete that struggles to run easy?
Yeah, one.
Well, I'd like to hear Matt's answer too, but I think Matt's written about this before, is that athletes are typically terrible at self-selecting and self-identifying intensity, right? So a typical athlete, even a well-seasoned athlete in general, is really bad at identifying using RPE, perceived effort, at their intensity. Some athletes can do it. Some athletes who really have honed in on their perceived effort versus their actual output can do it. But in general, and again, like Matt said, elite athletes did this, right? Elite athletes get the easy from the hard, and they naturally fall into this 80-20 endurance. So it kind of is almost a chicken and egg thing. Are they elite athletes because they inherently know the difference, or are they elite athletes because they can monitor and measure their intensity from some other device? And I think it's the former. You don't need a device to be a great measure of intensity, but most athletes aren't, is the point, right? So that most athletes can't do it. So I think that the answer to that is that you need a device to help you get that baseline, so that you understand what feels easy is not easy, or when you say what you think is zone 2 is actually zone 3 or zone X. And so I'd say for most athletes, give them the device and give them the zones and say, this is actually your zone 1, zone 2. I'm prescribing this many watts, I'm prescribing this much in pace or this much heart rate. And then they can kind of learn to attach that to their perceived effort and become better at self-monitoring in the long run.
Yeah, some athletes that I've never raised a toddler, but they can be a little bit like toddlers in that they hear you talk about the rules and then they try to bend them a little bit and like game the system. It's like, well, felt easy is easy, right? And just as with parenting a toddler, you got to be really careful there, because like if you're just like, oh, it's not worth it to just like, I'm tired of this fight, I'm just gonna like let it go this time. You start letting it go, and then it's not 80-20 anymore. And one day it's fine, but that's seldom what it is when you have athletes who are just trying to. So I have found in my experience, it's much easier. It's like tearing off a Band-Aid. Like you gotta like be on it. Like as soon as you see the trend starting, you're like, let's nip this. And it's really just sort of an ongoing conversation where you're like, I get it. Like it's not intuitive that like slowing down is going to make you faster, but like it's true. Trust me. Like take a leap of faith and just give it a try. Just like let's have some intensity hygiene here for the next period and see if I'm not right. See if you don't feel fresher the next day. See if you don't feel stronger the next time it's time to go hard. But yeah, it's like we all know it in the relationships we've had when like you have like whether it's a toddler or someone else start to try and nibble away at the boundary you've set. Like if you don't act quickly, you've lost.
Yeah. But I think my point is that you can't do that without some sort of device initially, right? You have to be able to monitor. As a remote coach, you need to rely on an objective third party like a device to give you that feedback on how they're actually doing, and then tell them that wasn't easy. You thought it was easy, it's not, and here's why.
That's great. Yeah, I wanted to hear that actually, because I hadn't even asked you guys that question before. And I think it's something a lot of coaches do struggle with, is people starting to especially when you're new to 80-20 as a coach, something you're maybe transitioning athletes to from a different zone model or a different way of training. And there will be a little bit of resistance to slowing down. And they will tell you, it felt good, because they're in that rut that David talks about. They go to that familiar place that they've been training at that wasn't giving them the results. So I do think you have to kind of, I have a saying with my athletes, like humor me for 2 weeks, humor me, do it for me, just please me. And then if you don't also feel better and see some like really good in the high intensity sessions, start feeling like good and see a little bit of squeaking of extra pace out there because you've really started to slow down in the stuff where you need to. And every time I've done that sort of 2 weeks of please humor me, make me happy, I don't tend to have a big problem again. Occasionally they'll fall in the rut, but I think that's human. We're not machines, so we will, but they self-regulate. They know they did that. So they're like, I took the next day off because I kind of overdid it yesterday. And you can see, oh, this is great. They're starting to, well, they'll tell you, hey, can you have a look at this? I think I might have pushed a little too hard in this session. And you can be like, yeah, you did. Tomorrow, let's ease it back a little bit and recover from that. So, but it is a little bit hard. The whole slowing down to get faster, not everybody, people want it to work, but they're very nervous to try it. So you as a coach, sometimes just asking them to humor you and they've got nothing to lose really and everything to benefit. So yeah, it's good to hear how you go. And then setting some, like instead of worrying about the zones, like do not exceed kind of guidelines on their watch. Like you can go anywhere underneath this, but as soon as you hit here, take a walk break, bring things down, recalibrate, so they start to get a feel for underneath that, where that line is. So.
All right, we're gonna go play pickleball.
Yes.
Right, that's our team activity. We're gonna go this pickleball
In the
thing.
snow.
In the snow. It's like snowing and freezing. We're gonna go try it anyway.
Hardcore.
That's right. Okay.
All right. Thank you guys.
See you, everybody.
Bye.